I would love to have, so in this next panel, this is our second session, for the afternoon, illustrative examples of science policy interactions. Me and my friend Sanjay, who is in front of me, just say hello. Hello.
Hello.
We will be the moderators. I will moderate the first session that is going from 14:55 to 15:65, something. Yes?
Yes.
And we're going to have 3 speakers. And without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Barbara Berardi to come forward. Dr. Barbara Berardi, she is a social scientist, anthropologist, citizen scientist, ecotoxicologist by training, by experience with dealing with very complex policy relationships. She's also the director of the research and advocacy of Pallinis in France. And Barbara, without further ado, if everyone is already inside, and if our audience at home is ready, I would like to give you the floor. You have a
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, ENSSER, for having me here today. I will present some preliminary results of an ongoing research on the agrochemical industry's role in shaping regulatory science in the EU, mainly based on documents obtained through access to documents requests and a legal action. In particular, I will highlight some of the agrochemicals industry strategies to maintain control over the epistemic form of pesticide risk assessment procedures for bees in the European Union. To this end, I will consider the case history of the bee guidance document published by the European Food Security Authority, EFSA, in 2013, but never adopted at the European level due to the lack of approval of the Standing Committee on Plants, Animals, Food and Feed, the so-called SCOPAF, that is a crucial but little known component of the EU decision-making chain. So just a few words on guidance documents. As you know, they are a key element of pesticide registration process, as they outline the required evidence, data formats, and study protocols necessary for evaluating risks. In other words, they shape what we officially know about pesticides and their effects, defining what qualifies as valid data knowledge in the framework of regulatory science. The industry has historically been involved in the production of guidance documents, and the current risk assessment scheme for bees, the so-called EPO test methods, are no exceptions. They could be considered a good example of a guidance document ignorant by design, as they ignore certain routes of exposure, certain effects, like, for instance, chronic, sublethal, and so on, impacts on juveniles and on bees other than honeybees, though these elements are crucial to apprehend the real toxicity of pesticides on pollinators. So, aware of these shortcomings, EFSA published in 2013 a new guidance document that could be considered a kind of regulatory science revolution. First of all, from the ecotoxicological perspective, because it includes many of the elements that were ignored in the previous risk assessment, such as larval and chronic toxicity tests, risk from metabolites, new routes of exposure, and so on. But it's also groundbreaking from an epistemological perspective, because it reverses many of the founding assumptions of classic epistemic form of regulatory science. It also displaces the borders between done and undone science. And furthermore, it adopts an overall precautionary approach to address potential risks. I forgot to switch. However, to be adopted at the EU level, guidance documents on pesticides need to be endorsed by the Standing Committee of Plants, Animal, Food and Feed, the SCOPAF. That is the risk managers. Just 2 words, SCOPAF is part of the comitology system, that is the system of committees in charge of technical procedures through which the European Commission implements EU law. It is very important to stress that the comitology system is not submitted to the transparency rules which apply to other EU institutions. Debates take place behind closed doors, names of participants are not public, individual member states' votes are confidential, and minutes of deliberations are not detailed. So what happened when the new guidance document landed at the SCOPAF? Should be stressed that at its inception, when it was published in 2013, the FSAB guidance document enjoyed a wide political and scientific consensus. However, between 2013 and 2019, it was discussed at least 30 times within the SCOPAF, which never adopted it. But why? So documents obtained through access to document requests shed some light on this. They show, for instance, that the European Crop Protection Association, now Crop Life, the Association of the Agrochemical Industry, carried out an intensive lobbying from 2013 onwards to oppose the adoption of the B guidance document. HUD documents seem also to indicate, worryingly, that the industry had open access to the SCOPAF members, despite the fact that their names are strictly confidential and inaccessible to other stakeholders and citizens. Here it is an example of an email sent from the European Crop Protection Association to the European Commission. And as you can see, there are also other addresses, and these addresses are those of the members of the SCOPAF. So despite the fact that the document is heavily censored, we know that this is the case also because in the letter that was attached to this email, the representative of the industry clearly states, I quote, "I'm copying this letter to members of the SCOFCA," that is the old name of the SCOPAF, "in BCC." So, of course, they had a privileged access to the SCOPAF members. And we can say that they used probably this privileged privileged access to deconstruct consensus around the EFSA-B guidance document. They utilize to this end a multifold strategy, undermining in particular certain scientific assumption of the guidance document. We don't have time to go into the details of such a deconstruction, but I would like just to highlight two main points. That is the scientific contestation of two elements which are the center on the industry disagreement with the guidance document. The first one is the contestation of the chronic toxicity test. Chronic toxicity is crucial to apprehend the real toxicity of pesticides on bee, in particular new generation pesticides. And for the first time, the EFSA-B guidance document included a chronic toxicity test into the risk assessment. A revolution. And the industry contested this test, and in particular, its trigger value that the industry considered to be too conservative, that is, too protective. The second element contested by the industry was the SPG, that is the chosen, the specific protection goal, that is the chosen level of protection. In this case, for the first time again, the EFSA-B guidance document introduced a specific protection goal that considered that 7% of maximum reduction of the colony size was the maximum tolerable effects on a bee colony. SPGs are particularly important because all the trigger values of all the tests are calibrated on them. So of course, this is a key element. And it should be also stressed that at the time of the publication of this document, risk managers agreed on this 7% maximum level of reduction following the use of one pesticide. It should also be stressed that this work substance by substance. So to come back to the chronic toxicity test, the industry delegitimization of this test is mainly based on an impact analysis of the pass-fail rate of the guidance document first year by pesticides already on the EU market. In other words, the industry took substances that were already authorized in Europe, and they tested them according to the first year, the laboratory tests of the new guidance document. And according to this impact analysis, the industry claimed that 100% of substances would fail the tier 1 risk assessment, as you can see in this excerpt of an email from the industry to the European Commission. This is very scaring, of course, 100% of substances not passing the first year. It is not surprising, though, that the industry produced such an impact and such a scaring impact analysis, because we know that is a common tool used by the industry to prevent or delay the adoption of more protective regulations or policies. What is more surprising in our case is this impact analysis conducted by the industry was disproved completely by the EFSA that conducted an impact analysis itself, and whose results are completely different from the results of the industry impact analysis. As you can read in this mail sent by one of the EFSA experts to the European Commission. The expert states, I quote, "As you can see below, the screening plus first year in the scheme is not overly conservative as always claimed by the industry. Even 50% of the insecticide pass the acute assessment and 30% the chronic assessment. Maybe we are not conservative enough," and the small smile. And these are more detailed results of the EFSA assessment. We don't have time to go through them, but it's enough to say that they are completely in line with the results of the academic research on the toxicity of some pesticides already on the market on pollinators. So the second challenge, scientific challenge of the industry against, is the attack against the SPGs, the specific protection goals. The industry attacked the science behind the calculation of this maximum effect permitted, allowed. And to this end, in particular, it attacked the model used to indicate that this was a protective limit for colony reduction, claiming that a much more effective model analysis, the so-called BHAVE analysis, model analysis, was now available, and it should have been used instead of the HURI model used by EFSA to identify this limit of 7%. And as you can see in this excerpt of the industry, of an email sent from the industry to the European Commission, apparently through this model, it could be demonstrated that an effect level of up to 30% would represent a negligible impact on colony strength. So these two arguments, so-called scientific arguments, were used over and over the years in the SCOPAF in order to obtain what was the main objective of the industry, the revision of the EFSA guidance of 2013. And indeed, the document got stuck inside the SCOPAF for 6 years. And at the end, the EC in May 2019 finally mandated the EFSA to revise it. And of course, following the industry's demand, BHAVE was employed to derive a threshold of acceptable effect on colony size based on background variability in the new guidance document. We don't have time to go through this. So EFSA conducted the exercise. It was a time-consuming and resource-consuming exercise. And the result, as you can see here, is that background variability, a honeybee colony, background variability ranges from 0 to 23%. That is something that every beekeeper knows very well. So in other words, BHAVE model didn't provide any clear basis for a decision that was, from the start, a political one. That is, what is an acceptable reduction of bee colonies following the use of one pesticide? So the ball was back in the scope of court that had to take a decision, and they couldn't again. So some of them were advocating to allow 23% of reduction of a colony following the use of a single pesticide that should have been disastrous for bees. Others were advocating for 10%, others 7%, and so on. At this point, to avoid another blockage, and especially to avoid the scope of opacity, the European Parliament and civil society associations like us asked the European Commission to move the issue at the council level, where the votes of the member states are public, so we can know who votes for what. And magically, all the member states advocating for 23% reduction of the colony size disappeared, and the Commission decided to allow a maximum permitted level of honeybee colony size reduction at 10% after the use of a pesticide. So just to conclude, very briefly, we have seen that the 2013 EFSA bee guidance represented a major shift of the dominant regulatory culture on risk assessment for bees, which did not meet with industry approval. In order to block its adoption, the industry exerted intensive lobbying on scope of members, taking advantage of its privileged access to this decision-making body, which is inaccessible to other stakeholders and to citizens in general. This lobbying, which aimed at deconstructing the scientific consensus around the guidance document, was based on two scientific arguments, which proved to be either incorrect, the impact analysis, or useless, the behave model. However, this did not prevent the industry from obtaining its revision, which was its main objective. So much for sound science. Many of the industry's requests have been integrated into the revision, and it is probably thanks to the more transparent discussion on SPGs, that is the possibility for the public to know the vote of each member state, that the selection of a disastrous SPG for bees was avoided. The new EFSA bee guidance document was published in 2023. From an ecotoxicological point of view, although it constitutes an obvious improvement of the obsolete EPO scheme, is less ambitious than the previous one. From an epistemological point of view, the groundbreaking approach which characterized the epistemic form of the 2013 version has disappeared. To notice that the new guidance document has not been adopted by the scope of yet. It means that since early 2000s, we are still conducting a risk assessment for bees according to a complete, insufficient, and obsolete risk assessment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Angelika Hilbeck. Most of you already met her yesterday. So she's coming to talk about courting rule demands the South Africa government to apply the precautionary principles in GMO approval requests. And without further ado, Dr. Angelika, the floor is yours.
As soon as the presentation is up. Thank you very much. And it actually wasn't planned that I'm the one who's going to give the talk here. I was only going to be a co-author. My dear colleague, Mariam Mayer, the director of the African Center for Biodiversity in Johannesburg, was going to present this case from South Africa. However, she fell ill and had to cancel her participation too late. So I decided, or in agreement with her and ACB, that I would give my version of it. Okay, so don't blame her if I say things wrongly or from my perspective, because I was part of that court case and give you my perspective of the role of science and science advice to civil societies in legal procedures. I think they are important. So how do I move this? This is the fabulous team. And I can start with the end. We won, okay, at the highest court. So the Supreme Court of Appeals of South Africa, we defeated them. But I'll try to explain to you from backwards, or from, you know, how we ended up there and what it took to get to this point. This is a fabulous team. I mean, I'm very proud on the diversity that really made this happen. A fabulous lawyer team, Zame Skibi, Nikki Steen, and Kameshni Pillay. They were our advocates. She was the chief advocate. And this is dear Mariam Mayer, who could not come here and present. Plus, we had other expert witnesses. I was an expert witness to the process. Other expert witnesses I'd like to acknowledge who were absolutely quintessential to the case were Professor Jack Heinemann. He might be online. I don't know if you hear me. Thank you. You were absolutely critical in this case. Same goes to Dr. Eva Sirinach-Sinji. I never am able to pronounce this properly. She knows it. And the whole ACB staff who worked tirelessly on this case for many, many years. So this was a truly David against Goliath. So from this list, you can see this is us, if I subsume myself under the ACB, and these were who we took to charge. Okay, so 6 respondents means the state predominantly and different layers of we didn't start at the Supreme Court. I guess everybody understands that you only end there after you went through the pipeline of courts all the way up. And so these were various government institutions, appeal boards, executive council, etc., ministries. And then these 2 respondents started out with Monsanto. So the court case is so old that Bayer hadn't bought up Monsanto at the time. And once Bayer bought up Monsanto, Bayer joined the case as well. So it was 6 respondents against us. And the case is the drought-tolerant maize in South Africa, an application for general release. This drought-tolerant maize, this is what we call the single gene maize, is a maize that only contains that supposedly, I must say, drought-tolerant trait in it as a single form. Otherwise, the maize doesn't contain other transgenes. Monsanto has applied in parallel, earlier or later, also for general release of other lines, of other events. Monate 9034 is a kind of a stack. It has 2 insecticidal Bt toxins plus the drought-tolerant trait. And in addition, Monsanto had made an application to the South African authorities for the commercial approval of yet a triple stack, they call it. It's basically this one, plus this one, and plus the drought-tolerant one, and glyphosate resistance in it, okay? And this one also was, all of them were also objected against by ACB. This was first an objection to the field trials and then an objection to further release. And just to note, for the whole drama to understand, in 2019, so you see the years in 2019, the Ministry of Agriculture rejected this triple stack, and they rejected it specifically on grounds of the drought tolerance gene in that triple stack maize event did not provide yield protection in water limited conditions. That was the conclusion of an expert committee that advised the Ministry of Agriculture, which made the Ministry of Agriculture to reject the triple stack. Nevertheless, Monsanto kept its single gene up, and that is the one that we still went against. Now, claims of drought tolerance, that's why I call it so-called drought tolerance, have always been spurious. They were never formally, for a long, long time, published, and if it was published, it was strictly by Monsanto people published, and the data in it was always shaky and certainly not clear. This is a quote from its petition for determination of the non-regulated status in the United States, submitted already in 2007 or 6, so it's a long time ago. And these were the actual claims in legal documents they made, okay? So they didn't speak about drought tolerance. They spoke about water-limited conditions, whatever they are, and were stated that MON 87460 hybrids were expected, not proven, documented, etc., to provide 6% or greater, whatever, yield advantage, another term that is, you know, a lot of interpretations possible for that, compared to commercial hybrids, whatever. So that's a very, very fluid definition. So anything can go basically under this definition. Of course, it was deregulated. The United States do not approve. They deregulate, meaning the responsibility for what you say and the validity of what you say rests upon the commercial entity, on the applicant, and not on USDA. So for us who serve under approval systems, it is the approving organization and agency that can be held accountable if they put their minds to it. And similar is in South Africa. So you can hold them accountable for their decisions. There were other papers, you know, where the claims of yield advantage and whatever it should do, you can read it up if you're interested in. There was a USDA assessment after a number of years that these varieties were on the market in the US agriculture. This was a report in January 2019, and they came, it's a longer report, I just extracted some of the pertinent information. They checked on also on BT and herbicide-tolerant transgenics, but among the drought-tolerant varieties, most of which were non-transgenic, that the only deregulated claimed drought-tolerant variety by Monsanto made up to 3% of the market. And we don't even know whether the farmers who chose to buy these varieties did so because of the drought tolerance, because mostly it is bred together with other traits, and the farmers might have chosen that variety because of the BT or the HT trait, and the drought tolerance was just in it for good measure. So this is not a blockbuster. I think that's pretty safe to say. That wasn't very a success story, and it's to no surprise for people who understand that a complex trait like drought tolerance cannot be conferred by a single gene, let alone by a very generic gene like the cold shock protein that they used in this one. Now, in South Africa, when they continued to keep that particular single gene trait variety and insisted on approving it, despite the fact that the triple stack had been rejected on grounds of the drought tolerance trait not performing according to assessment. They kept this up. ACB took them to court on that as well and continued the litigation against it. And after 9 long years, they won with a full bench of 5 judges of the Supreme Court of Appeals in Bloemfontein set aside. That's a term for rejecting all layers of previous rulings of appeals and sending the document and the approval application back to the first instance of where it should start properly. But they gave him a number of lectures. And that is what I found interesting from my perspective of having been somebody, a scientific expert advisor, providing affidavits, so sworn documents to the courts, how this came about and what the court, the appeal court, took issue with. So this was the final analysis. You can read this up. Here's the official ruling and the rulings and the links to the rulings are all public. You can read it up. Judge Tolmay was, I was there at this hearing as well. Her judgment on her interpretation on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle was very important in this ruling, had been set aside. The approval of the executive committee had been set aside. The appeals board decision had been set aside, and the ministry decision had also been set aside. So it was a full-fledged sending it back to square one, and told that Monsanto now Bayer's application has been sent back for the Commission for the Executive Council for reconsideration. So they should start all over again. Now, what the judges found was a failure of the Executive Council, of the councils of the government, to comply with a mandatory prescript contained in their GM law to determine whether Monsanto was required to submit an environmental impact assessment. So it is on formalities, okay? So the judges would never rule on whose side. So there were expert witness number of them, of course, on behalf of Bayer and Monsanto. There's no limit to that on that side. And they had, of course, very different interpretations and arguments. And the judges in the courts never would rule on whose science is correct. They cannot do that. That would be far outside of their realm. But what they do is they look, did the state and the agencies, the relevant regulatory bodies, did they follow due process? Did they put their minds to it? That was a term that was used. Or did they just rubber stamp what was presented to them by the applicant at face value without doing a proper independent own assessment of the validity of that claim and of the submitted evidence in support of that claim? So that is what they looked at. It's a formal, technical, formal judgment it was. And one was to determine whether an impact assessment or risk assessment was necessary or not, which is requested if certain triggers are documented by law under the precautionary principle that is enshrined also in the South African law. ACB had always, that was the prime reason why they took them to court, because it was blatantly obvious when you read the commentaries and the judgments of the agencies that they simply had done copy-paste jobs and taken over one-to-one the arguments of the company. And that was to that extent obvious that it was very difficult to deny. And they didn't necessarily deny it, they just justified and said this was okay. We don't need to use other words if we agree with what they say. That is kind of a reasoning there. Okay, they came, this is now from from the judgments out of the ruling from the courts. The expert opinions, which were affidavits, so this is not just a document you write in an afternoon and ship over there. This is a quite substantive piece of document, all with scientific evidence, publications, references, etc., and sworn by notary public to be then sent to the courts in South Africa. Quite an interesting experience for me. And this is what the judges found. They made by the three experts concerned with scientific issues listed in the unanimous verdict, which should have triggered the application of the precautionary principle by law. And they found the experts who provided the opinions in support highlighted several fundamental concerns, all of which were articulated in the appeal document that served before the appeal board. So the appeal board was called, why didn't you put your mind to it, what was said there? When regard is had to the Cartagena Protocol, which requires that claims of scientific certainty be substantiated with evidence to prove a lack of a potential of a scientific hazard, Monsanto's risk assessment was inadequate and in identifying plausible hazards. They just had wiped them off the table, said there aren't any, and it is because we say so. Monsanto's claims, for example, of lack of allergenicity were unsubstantiated. Monsanto itself had indeed identified a fragment of protein that was resistant to pepsin digestion. That's a standard test for allergenicity that all of these have to go through. And if you find there is a resistant piece that isn't digested in an experimental setup, this should trigger next tier level tests in order to make sure that this is not on the radar as a hazard. Of course, Monsanto did none of that. They in fact showed that there is high expression of CSP bacterial protein in the pollen, but it has not conducted any studies on the potential and likelihood of allergenic responses in pollen. Instead, and given the fact that there is no history of safe use of this particular variety and protein, data submitted by Monsanto in support of its safety claims were based on fermented and digested forms of the product. And I may want to add, stemming from bacteria, not from the plant. So this is a list. This is all from the ruling. Okay, so you can read this up. It's on page 20, I think. There was no evidence in the record before the Executive Council, the Appeal Board, and the Ministry on the effects of food processing and the safety of human exposure via cooked traits, Mon 87460 maize, in South African human diets, not just feed. In South Africa, people eat this. It's feed as well, but people are eating this just as much, if not more. And the only data included were summaries of the following: a chicken feeding trial with raw maize, acute toxicity study on mice with bacterially derived isolated protein, an unspecified rat feeding study, a broiler chicken study with food quality standards to be measured, not adverse impacts on health. And this was particularly what I had put my mind to, going through their field data that they had submitted and finding that the aggregated field trial summaries, which was all what we got, and very rough, hardly any materials and methods, which contained insufficient information to interpret and apply the findings to the application for the approval. This all, in summary, the Supreme Court of Appeals unanimously to the conclusion that the government bodies before it hadn't put their minds to it, and Monsanto lawyers in front of the court couldn't sufficiently explain, because the judges asked them, I was in the courtroom, I listened to it, asked them specifically, so why do you claim this? Where's the evidence for that claim? And I was really surprised by the quality of those judges. They went through thousands of pages of documents and pinpointed and said, on page X, you're identifying there is this pepsin-resistant piece of protein. You yourself are identifying on page X, line Y, that there could be a minimal risk, or whatever adjective you use, risk resulting from this resistant pepsin digestive resistant protein. And then we read 1,000 pages down the line when it comes to the overall conclusion that your minimal risk determination became a no risk determination. And then they asked and said, where from here to there did you make a formal determination? What made you make it from X risk to no risk? Have we overlooked something? And of course, I couldn't say that. And I found a funny, interesting argument of the Monsanto who was caught cold by this, who argued and said, well, it is so minimal or marginal, whatever the term they used, it is basically by omission that this isn't triggering anything further, that this is basically no risk. So the term by omission struck me. I'm not sure I fully understood what they meant with that, but I'll show you later. This is coming up again. By omission, you can request basically an exception that you don't have to make formal determination. The court says, but it wouldn't have taken you much. You just would have written, formal determination that X, Y, and Z. Why didn't you do that? So the fun fact is, for me as somebody who's been going through hundreds of these documents and dossiers for the European regulator, for the US regulators, for civil societies and whatnot, I've read them all and they're basically always the same. There's minimal differences in some nuances to the jurisdiction they supply them to, but the core data that is submitted to them is always the same. So we've seen those data in front of EFSA, in front of USDA or FDA and EPA. We saw them all already. But it was the South African court who put their minds to it and took the government agencies to task and said, why didn't you see that? Why didn't you make formal determination? They never said that this is correct or there is a danger or whatever, but they said, why didn't you formally make an assessment or trigger the precautionary principle and request it from the applicant to submit more data in order to determine and support their claim of no risk in the end. So they actually gave, with this ruling, teeth to the precautionary principle, and it has precedent-setting authority. It is unappealable in this court, and it applies to other GMO dossiers as well. And fun fact is, we have the same ones, and we have no ruling of this kind here in Europe. And we also rule supposedly under the precautionary principle. My last slide, update on 25 on May this time now, the South African government, the only legal step that is still available to the respondents is that they take it to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court is not ruling on technical issues anymore, whether you have breached regulations or that. They're judging it by mega criteria like food security, human rights, social inclusion, impacts, etc. So it's a whole different ball game you can submit to. And that's what the South African government did, not Monsanto, not Bayer. They did have so far not joined that. We didn't see any evidence that they've joined that request for leave to appeal. That means requesting that they can submit their case in front of the Constitutional Court to be ruled. Now, the Constitutional Court does not need to take every case. So it's now in their court. They may have to make a decision whether or not they even accept this. That decision should be coming soon. If they accept it, then we will continue to see and meet the lawyers in court. And I look quite a bit forward to that, because I'd be interested to see how they want to argue that on food security levels and human rights and social inclusion, etc. That's it from my side, because I looked at it not from a legal, but from how scientific advice is, looked at in legal procedures. I've had other court cases in Europe where we followed. It was always very, very difficult to bring scientific advice or scientific data into the courtroom and have courts even consider it, look at it. Most judges, like the judge before this one, Judge Tolmay, were like, don't bother me with scientific details. I don't even want to see your data because I am in no position to judge off that data. So I just need procedural breaches. You have to convince me that there is a procedural breach. Okay, that's it from my side.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Elena Debris. She's an investigator for the Lighthouse reports. Elena, she will be here talking about how to obstruct critical science, the bonus event files, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I am Elena Debray, and I'm an investigative journalist with Lighthouse Reports, and I'm going to talk to you about something you may not have heard of before, which is a platform called Bonus Eventus, but it uncovered, I think, something a lot of people in the room have experienced before, which was a coordinated campaign with government and industry to suppress scientific research and environmental activists' work. So just a little bit of background to start. So Lighthouse Reports, we are a team of international investigative journalists. We're based all over the world, but also have an office here in Athens, conveniently. So we look at systemic issues from migration to food systems, which is where this investigation came out of, and we do long-term projects. We don't publish ourselves. We're not a platform, but we partner with different publications to tell several stories across multiple mediums for each investigation. So for this one, the Bonus Eventus files, we did a documentary with Africa Uncensored. We did articles with The Guardian, Le Monde, among other publications. So we began this investigation trying to look at a systemic problem in modern agriculture, which was that these sustainable, non-chemical options for farming exist, and yet they're consistently not implemented and not funded. And we wanted to see what were these kind of invisible forces and who or what was preventing agroecological solutions from coming to the forefront, from being chosen for being financed and promoted. So as journalists, we did what we do best, and we began talking to some people. And we started talking to Hans Herren, who is an expert on this subject, and he gave us a tip, and he told us to look at this conference that was supposed to take place, and did take place in Kenya in 2019. And it was going to be the first agroecological presentation of international research placed in the Global South. And it was scientists were going to present their work, as well as a lot of scientists who were presenting research that was talking about the risks of pesticides and GMOs. And what was different about this conference is that all these kind of invisible barriers kept popping up one after another. They just felt like every step forward they tried to make with planning this conference, something would prevent it. And the biggest thing that happened was that one of their main funders pulled out with no explanation. It was the Africa Development Bank, and they just said, we had an internal discussion, and now we're pulling our sponsorship for the conference. As well as around leading up to the conference, as well as around the time of the conference, there were media reports circulating, dismissing the conference as propaganda. And so it seemed like that there were these power players who were working behind the scenes to undermine this conference and to keep pesticides in good favor and on the market. But it was really hard to track and identify who was behind not only disrupting and undermining this conference, but also just the larger discussion about pesticides and GMOs in scientific and public communities. So we dove in to figure this out. So it was not an easy task, but there's some, journalistic tools that we use when wanting to kind of come up against this big black box of a problem. And so one is sending a Freedom of Information Act request. And so we had some sense that there was a bit of US government discussion around this conference. And so we filed a Freedom of Information request with different US agricultural departments. And what we found were documents filled we were asked for communications around the conference. And so what we found were documents filled with email messages. And what kept coming up one after another was this one firm, a public relations firm, was emailing members of the US government, as well as African government officials, as well as top pesticide and chemical company executives, warning about this conference and brainstorming ideas of how to quiet the conference's messaging. And so the days after we were matching up the dates and the timeline that the firm sent out those emails, the conference's main funder pulled out. So we wanted to understand who this firm was. It was a public relations firm called Vfluence, led by a man named Jay Byrne, and how this person was spearheading a campaign with both governments and agrochemical companies in order to oppose pesticides and GMOs. So we turned to the courts, and we searched for this company and its leader through court records and documents, and we saw that it's the company, the PR company, Vfluence, and its leader had a long history of working with Syngenta around their messaging of the pesticide paraquat. And they were currently in the middle of a massive lawsuit. They were being sued by farmers in the US who had Parkinson's disease, and were accusing this PR company and its leader of leading this 20-year campaign to cover up the link between paraquat and Parkinson's disease. So now that we knew that it was cozy with the agrochemical industry and also was communicating with both government and industry. We were also curious where it was getting its funding. So we looked into the funding in US government funding databases, and we discovered that over several years, the Vfluence, the PR company, had received over $400,000 for services that included counteracting critics of modern agricultural approaches in Asia and Africa. And they were also commissioned to set up a private social network portal in order to gather intelligence of those deemed critical to modern agricultural approaches. This private social network, we were able to see by looking through the funding records, was called Bonus Eventus, named after the Roman god of agriculture and meaning good outcome. We also saw a contract that was set up for close to $5 million for this PR company, and another one it worked closely with that was aimed around undermining the EU's farm to fork strategy. So now we were getting to the heart of what this unseen force was, and it was a secret platform that was built with government funds and aimed to gather information about and undermine critics of pesticides and GMOs around the world. So through going through source networks for their interviews, more freedom of information requests, we discovered what was inside the secret network. And at the core of it was a library of profiles, and it held profiles on environmentalists, academics, scientists, anyone that the network deemed as a threat of pesticides and GMOs and agricultural industry interests. Many, one of the most kind of esteemed scientists on it is in the room with us today, Angelica, and as well as UN experts like Hillel Elver, US food writers, Michael Pollan, Nimo Bassi, and these profiles held really deeply personal details of the subjects. It detailed marital trauma and turmoil, and another, it gave names of family members and their addresses. It gave home values. It talked about an old traffic violation someone had. And they were also written in this very disparaging manner in a way that seemed aimed to undermine and discredit its subjects, with long criticism sections highlighting critiques of the professional careers of its subjects. And the information in these profiles was accessible to only a select group of members who were granted invites, but they were also very powerful people. They were government officials from all over the world and regulators and their lobbyists, as well as agrochemical executives from Syngenta, CropLife. And these members could communicate with each other on this network itself. And they also received weekly newsletters promoting news that was favorable to the industry. It always had highlighting basically industry critics' recent work in a denigrating manner, and also warning about upcoming events that counter the industry's agenda. And the agroecology conference in Kenya that we began with was one of them. So as part of our investigation, we spoke to those who had been profiled, and many were deeply concerned to see this kind of government coordination with industry so up close and so close to home. And it was disturbing for many that either a foreign government or a government that they pay taxes to was paying a company to discredit them, as well as to put their own privacy at risk. And it's something that you kind of think may be happening. And it was very, I think, strange to be confronted with that, as well as there is kind of a flip side of it as well, which is this method of just shooting the messenger shows that the industry didn't really have any real arguments that could hold up to the real science that was being produced. And I want to bring in a second Angelica up here to talk for maybe 2 minutes about her experience, but I'll just end quickly before that on a little bit of what happened since, and which is that, so actually after our investigation, the network ceased its profiling activities after publication. They lost contracts with trade associations and companies that had associated with them before. And they made staff cuts and they were close to shutting down, which was really, I think, a great impact of this work and shows the power of journalism. But of course, the industry and its allies were not happy with the reports. And so it gave us journalists a chance of what it's like to be a target of some of what we're writing about. The unseen forces of obstruction don't really like to be revealed, but I think at the same time, it reminds us that if you become a target for those who want to keep the truth buried, it means that you've done your job and you've revealed the truth. So thank you. And Angelica, I would really love to hear a little bit from you about your experience, because we interviewed you and showed you your profile for this bonus Eventus. And it was, I think, kind of interesting experience, and I'd be remiss to not invite you up here when you're here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, bravo first to the brave journalists, young women, and the other one I spoke to was also, I think, a young woman. So very courageous to take these companies and these powers on in that junior age. I know what I'm talking about because I did the same mistake and started fairly young with that. But you can survive it and you come out resilient. So that's me now, 30 years down the road. Well, when I was contacted and they told me there's a profile and there's this network and it didn't surprise me, okay? But that is owed to my seniority. It would have surprised me 30 years earlier, but now it was like a confirmation of what I knew anyway. And it was actually kind of a relief because now I had it black and white. You know, what we suspected or knew was happening anyway, finally got documented. It wasn't just a speculation or whatever. It was like, yes, we know. It's clear. And why we knew is because, and me and all the others, I mean, excellent company there. I think it's a badge of honor, actually. I considered it a badge of honor with a pope. Was a pope in there as well? My goodness. Yeah, amazing. So is when you are subjected to these smear campaigns, and it started early in my career, as I said, and the same lies pop up independently in different parts of the world, in different connections, you know there is a coordination. They always underestimate our intelligence, and that's to their demise, not to my demise. And this was just another confirmation of what we felt was going on and happening all the time anyway. What I was surprised, though, about is the miserable quality of what they call information, because it wasn't information, at least not on me. I didn't see others, but on me, it was just smear and lies. They called me profession. They have a little rubrics, and when it says profession, it says activist. So it makes my university, which is one of the top universities in the world, an activist organization. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, an activist organization, because they paid 100% of my salary, okay? That's ridiculous. I mean, what kind of an information is that? Who would want this, okay? And then there was nothing in it that you couldn't find. It was public. I actually, when I heard I'm on this, I was like, oh, let me see, because we all had different things happening to our lives. And I was wondering if I might find a resolution there where, you know, what happened might finally resolve itself, the mystery. But no, it was all cut, paste from conferences, from what I said publicly, what I argued publicly, but without reference. No reference, no chance for the people to go there and check for themselves. And it was always embedded with commentary. with smear, okay? Oh, she has the audacity to say la, 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 la. And oh, she has the gall to make la, 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 la. And then, of course, no reference to when I said what, so they could possibly understand my reasoning and my scientific arguments, my references, my science that I have always in support of the claims that I make. So my question to you is, given that smear, it's not intel, it's not information that's valuable. There's nothing in it for the recipients. I'm very sorry to tell all the US taxpayers that your money is dearly wasted there, because who are the people who get that information? Do they not want to know facts about their opponents? Is smear they want to know, or is it a propaganda dissemination website rather than information dissemination website? So that's a question I wanted to have answered from you. Who are the recipients? Do you know who they are?
So yes. Oh. Thank you. So the recipients of the information were the members. So it was USDA officials, USAID officials. There were high government regulators in Kenya, in Australia, in India. It was in Asia as well. It's like it was basically government regulators and their lobbyists is basically who were the members. So it was the US UN ambassador to the FAO, Kip Tom was part of it. So yeah, it was pretty high-ranking government officials, and I think that the information, as you say, is smear because but I think that it was a paid-for service that they saw as fact on some of these people, and
it was lies.
Right, which is scary, yeah, and what we hoped to expose.
Thank you. Questions from the audience now. I'll take maybe 1-2 questions, and then, so we have one question here, Ole, and one from Christina. Next.
Thank you for 3 very, very good talks. I have a question, really, I guess it's for Angelica. Can you somehow generalize the experience that you've had in South Africa? I mean, it didn't look as if you had more lawyers than Monsanto and Bayer had, but were you simply fortunate to have some very good judges? Or were you fortunate that the quality of the response from Monsanto was so low quality? Can you generalize somehow? Because I think going to the courts has proven in some cases to be the way to go. But often the courts, the opposition, the biotech, agrotech industry can afford many more lawyers than an NGO can. Can you generalize somehow? I'm
generalizing without stereotyping. That's trying to do. No, but foremost, clearly what comes to mind, nothing is fortune there. Okay, very little is luck or fortune. The most important key part and aspect was Mariam Mayer. She's a lawyer by training, and she understands the law. She understands the dossiers. She understands how it works, and she had the wisdom and the vision to take these things to the courts and litigate arguments there and be persistent and sustained. There's very few. I've not met anybody else who would do this at this level with that stamina, that razor blade sharp arguments. Her team that has been writing arguments on spot on, and the brilliant the lawyer Kameshni Pillai, the chief advocate in our case. She was also brilliant. She understood the law. She understood what needs to be argued and what does not need to be argued. So we were put in our place by them. They told, when we scientists, we were like, oh, but the science says, and oh my God, the data is so clear. It's like, no, don't go away with the data. Write your statement, and then we need to put it in perspective in legal terms. So it's competence, expertise, vision, sharp, dry, cold thinking, no emotions. You don't need to get entangled in any of this. And then persistence, appeal and point, no, you're wrong, and daring it, be brave and say we dare it. Monsanto had, as you said, of course, gosh, they had a team triple number in the people, and I don't even know how many people operated in the background there. I think the only luck we might have had was, my personal take from what I've witnessed personally, is that the lawyers, they would hate me for saying that. We had conversations with them. There was no hostility among the lawyers there in front of the court. They were unprepared, I think, and did not expect the level of depth that these judges would put their minds to, and would actually read the material and be familiar with the material. As I said, they said page number 100, X line 27, you said this, and page plus hundreds of pages down, you said line X this. How does that match? Can you explain that to us? And that lawyer hadn't had that. He had not expected, they had not expected that it would come to this level of depth and acribie, we would say, scrutiny and due diligence. So I was deeply impressed with the judges, and they were 5, and they were unanimous. I couldn't sense on any other board that any was even doubting. And it was a very diverse board. So in South Africa, it's always important. Men, females, males, different genders, colors, whatnot. And they were all unanimous. I mean, we could feel in the end already, we couldn't believe it, actually. We were very surprised. We had not expected that, you can imagine, because all lower courts were like, oh, if Monsanto says so, then who are you? Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but they were not that. They were absolutely diligent. One last notice, what they did, I forgot to mention, they took the government representative who was also there on behalf of, on the side of the corporate respondent, and said something to the effect of, don't you think it would be rather your role as the state to be on our side and help the law to bring out the best than to be on the corporate side? That was pretty moving, and they were quite stunned by that question.
Thank you.
So they took it serious, separation of power, and so I was impressed, deeply impressed.
We have 3 minutes, and we have Eva wanting to also make some comments. So could Eva be joining
Eva,
us online and speak? Hello, Eva.
Hello, everybody. I'm. Thank you very much for this conference. I wish I could be there with you. I just wanted to make a quick comment on just to fully agree with what Angelica said, that Miriam, her tenacity and her perseverance and her expertise as a lawyer, really, it was amazing to watch, and I feel very lucky to be a part of that and to work with Angelica on that with her. And just to agree fully with Angelica, and also with the question that I think there was a bit of a combination of as Mariam always reminded us, that the South African constitution is very strong post-apartheid, and I think that was partly one of the reasons that helped us, and also the sloppiness, if I may say so, of the evidence that was presented by Monsanto. I think the food safety part was one of the things that I looked at, and this problem they had with the lack of digestion of the trans protein. I think as Angelica said, we've seen these sort of problems come up before. We pointed to the same problems in a million objections that we've done, but it was the first time that it was actually being picked up on that I'd seen. And it was the sloppiness of Monsanto, for example, in the data they said at first that this protein was digested, and then that's fine. But then when we got the extra data, we could still see there on the gel, this protein was clearly there, but they still said it's disappeared. So finally, we had someone to pick up the point that the Monsanto's, there's a lack of basic consistency in their claims, and it was, it's things that we've seen for years. And me and Angelica looking at this going, oh my God, how come this is being said by Monsanto? And clearly the data doesn't show that. So I think it was just, we had this finally an opportunity to be able to point to this and someone to actually listen. And this gaslighting that we've felt for so long was finally being, there was accountability for it. And I think the lawyers was so incredible that they felt like they were scientists. They grasped all of the issues that we've raised over the years. So yeah, just like to add that to the situation. I think it's a combination of all of those things, as Angelica said. And yeah, thank you. And thank you, Angelica, for summarizing that. And good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you so much for joining us. One last question from Christina. We only have time for one question. I'm so sorry. We don't want to accumulate. We want to accumulate knowledge, not time delay. So, Christina.
I want to be short. First, I want to join the applause for Mariam Mayet.
Yes, yes.
Secondly, I'm very thankful for mentioning the Freedom of Information Act and its importance. Thirdly, I have a question or an invitation, really. There is the Principle 10 of Rio, which is also called the democracy principle, meaning public information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice for the public in environmental and health matters. And this has been implemented in the Aarhus Convention. And I think the Aarhus Convention is a tool that ENSSER should use more. It's also in Latin America, the Escazú Agreement, much later. And my experience is whenever the Aarhus Convention is being quoted by civil society or scientists to get at government documents, they arrive, although they have been withheld for years before that. Governments don't comply with the obligation to make the rights of the public public. So even ENSSER doesn't use that tool, and I simply wanted to extend the invitation to join and make use of the Aarhus Convention, which has a very, very strong compliance committee, very different from most other conventions, and 80% of successful applications are being made by civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Wait. I would like my panel to reply. I will ask each one briefly to address the comment of Christina for 40 seconds.
I can start. Yes, this is, we don't use the Aarhus Convention, but we use the European procedure to access documents. And indeed, it was like a nightmare because we first asked the documents I discussed during my presentation. First, we asked to access these documents, and the European Commission denied access. So we, for the second time, asked for access to document, and the European Commission refused to give us the documents. So we went to the European Ombudsman, and the European Ombudsman judged that it was maladministration, and recommended the European Commission to give us access to these documents, and the European Commission refused anyway. At that point, we went to court and we did a legal action, and thanks to this legal action, we got full access to the an important part of documents for which the access was denied. But it took us like 4 years to get these documents. Just to explain now, the rules are little different, and thanks to the Aarhus Convention. And for environmental matters, it could be easier from now on, but I will see anyway, I'm going to try, of course.
I will keep it brief. I spoke enough already. If there is any young scientists here or in an online, my advice to them is get a good science degree, but get a legal degree as well. If you want to operate in the space, it helps if you have legal expertise. I had none, absolutely none, and I had to learn it the hard way. You can shorten some processes and come faster to your goal if you understand, have expertise like Mariam had and had the vision. Thank you. Or get a good lawyer, yeah, but they're expensive.
Yeah, all to say is that, yeah, it's a really great idea. And we have a few other investigations we're doing now where we plan to use that. And if you have any other tips of getting information fast, please come to me.
Thank you so much, the three of you. We had agrontology, litigation, suppression. This has been one of the most inspiring practical cases that we had maybe in the last couple of congresses the ENSSER organized. So maybe next time we have to give it more space and go into more depth into the 3 and 4 experiences. And well, you are brave women. I'm really proud to be part of a group like yours. So yeah, thank you. Thank you.